Good day, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about plate boundaries. From our previous lesson, we discovered that plate boundaries are marked by active volcanoes, frequency of seismicity or earthquake, and mountain ranges. So whenever you find this tree in a place, which means that that place is under or within a plate boundary. So what are plate boundaries and how are they created? Plate boundaries are formed between plates due to interaction. Convergent plate boundary is found between plates that are moving toward each other. When the plates are moving apart, in between them is called divergent plate boundary. Transform fault boundary is found between plates that are sliding past one another. So how does plate boundaries are formed? Let us consider these 9 blocks. Suppose that these blocks are the lithospheric plates of the Earth. Suppose that E moved towards block letter H. So what plate boundary exists between B and E? Since E moved away from letter B, divergent plate boundary is formed. Now what plate boundary exists between E and H? Since E moves toward H, it is said to be convergent plate boundary. How about the boundary that exists between B and block E? B is steady while E moves down, so they slide past one another, and what lies between them is transform plate boundary. So let us try another one. Suppose that these blocks represent lithospheric plates of the Earth, and block E moved towards F. What plate boundary exists between blocks E and B? So they slide past one another, and therefore it is a transform fault boundary. How about boundary between blocks E and F? So since E moved towards F, what lies between them is convergent plate boundary. How about the plate boundary that exists between blocks D and E? So since E moved away from letter D, divergent plate boundary exists between these two blocks. Remember that convergent plate boundary is found between plates that are moving towards each other. And also bear in mind that plate can be characterized as oceanic or continental. So we have different types of convergence. It can be a convergence of continental and oceanic crust. It can be convergence of two oceanic crusts. It can be convergence between two continental crusts. The convergence of continental oceanic crusts provide us different geologic feature and geologic event. Remember that oceanic crust is denser than continental crust. So the tendency during their collision is oceanic crust will subduct underneath the continental crust. And that portion is what we call subduction zone. And on the surface, it will make an indentation, or it will leave a mark called a trench. So this trench is said to be the deepest part of the ocean. When oceanic crust subducts, it reaches the mantle. And once it reaches the mantle, the edge of the oceanic crust starts to melt and find its way to the surface and forms volcano on the top of the continental crust. The best example for the collision of continental oceanic crust is the collision of Eurasian plate and Philippine plate. Philippine plate is an oceanic plate. So once it collides with the continental Eurasian plate, it's subducted and the materials from it, from the edge of the Philippine plate, rose and forms the Philippine island. So we have the subduction zone, and on the surface forms the trench. And remember that volcanic arc aligns parallel with the trench. It's just that trench are formed on both sides of the Philippine island. At the middle of it, there, from here going there, from here going there, that is what we call the Philippine Mobile Belt. This portion of the Philippines is said to be made of blocks of rocks. That's why we have series of fault system. So now let us have the convergence of two oceanic crusts. Scientists were able to find out that the older oceanic crust is the one that used to subduct. So similar to the collision of continental oceanic crust, there is also subduction here. But the trench that these two oceanic crusts created is way too deeper than the trench created by the continental oceanic crust convergence. And since there is a subduction of oceanic crust here, the molten materials will find its way to the surface and forms a volcano, which may grow into a volcanic island. Mariana's Trench is an example of a resulting geologic feature by the collision of two oceanic crusts. Philippine Plate and Pacific Plate are both oceanic crusts. So when they collided, Pacific Plate, being the older oceanic crust or oceanic plate, subducts underneath the Philippine Plate and forms the underwater Marianas Island. So now let us have the convergence of two continental crusts. Remember that continental crusts are less dense than the oceanic crust. Since there is no oceanic crust involved in this collision, there will be no subduction. The only thing that you should remember in this type of convergence is the collision zone, because at the collision zone, crust is thicker since the edge of two colliding continental crusts are folded. The best example for the collision of two continental crusts is the collision of Indian plate with the Eurasian plate, forming the Himalayan mountain range. Now, let us have the divergent plate boundary. Divergent plate boundary is found between plates that are moving away from each other. It may happen between two continental crusts, which is called a reef valley. It may also happen between two oceanic crusts, which is called an oceanic ridge or a ridge. So let us take African Great Reef Valley as an example to the divergence of plates. Also, the Red Sea, notice that the shape of the Arabian plate is somehow a complementary to the shape of the African plate. Now this is how the African Great Rift Valley looks like. Another example to divergence of plate under the water is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Finally is the transform fault boundary. This type of plate boundary is found between two plates that are sliding past one another. And the best example for this is the San Andreas Fault Understanding plate boundaries allows us understand and appreciate how Earth renews its land and reshape the surface. With the movement of plates, it gave the Earth's surface different landforms like mountains, volcanoes, and valleys. Aside from that, understanding plate boundaries allows us to determine places that are prone to disaster. So is Philippines a country prone to disaster? Why? So that is all for today. Happy e-learning, everyone!